All right, friends, if you'll find your way to your seat, we're going to get ourselves rolling. We've got such a good crowd today, I think I'd rather just preach a sermon. And the exits are filled, so it's great to have everybody here today. And I think the first and best thing to do is let's begin with prayer together. So I'll give just a second. I'm going to do a mic check to be sure we're good back there. And while I'm mic checking, we're good, okay. So that means hurry to your seat or you're going to be walking during the prayer. And my grandmother forbade that. So, all right, we'll gather here. I'll give you all just a second. Thank you for coming today. And I'm looking forward to 4 o'clock. As you know, I'm an expert in all things, aren't I? So anyway, let's pray. Oh God, today we give you thanks for the gift of life, and we thank you for the gift of the church. And Lord, we thank you that you love each one of us with an undying love, a love that reaches to us while we are broken and lost and sometimes so filled with our own sense of self-importance that we are blinded. Oh God, we just come to you as people who need you desperately. We need your grace and we need the touch of your hand upon us. We need the power of your Holy Spirit to just flow through our church anew and to one church, one place at a time, Lord. Just bring renewal to us and put that heart strangely warmed feeling and heritage back into our souls. Lord, we pray for our church, and like us, our church is struggling. And so as we come together today, just ask that you would grant us a sense of your presence and give us a sense of your direction and purpose. We give you the glory and honor in all things, and we pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen. Now let me give you just a quick overview of kind of what I'm looking at and thinking about today. In a minute, I'm going to review I think I've got us kind of broken into 5 different steps. So I'm going to ask for kind of a show of hands on where you are, because I'm going to try to respond to the needs of this group versus just giving you a prepackaged deal. So I want to do that first. I'm going to try to cover as much ground as we can. At the end of our time together, it's going to be appropriate that we have Holy Communion, a brief service of worship that really is centered around Holy Communion. So we'll do that. A little bit of a break right before we take communion together and receive it. I don't know if you really take communion, do you? We really receive that. We don't take God, we receive God. And so anyway, my old line thinking comes out every once in a while, so y'all pardon me. I hope that we'll have a generous spirit toward each other. We don't all think alike on anything. We do on a lot of things, but we've all got differences of opinion on stuff. We understand our faith differently, and I would just invite us to gather in a spirit that extends graciousness and hospitality to one another and acceptance of one another. And so we differ, and as we get through this, some solutions have emerged, or potential solutions have emerged in terms of a way forward for us. So what I want to do is really kind of begin now with the idea. I want to ask this question of you, and if you do this with a show of hands, this will help me figure out where we need to go today. If this is either your first hearing or you need an overview or a history of how we got here, would you lift up your hands? So that helps me. If you need to know kind of where are we right now in this process, I'm going to lift my hand on this one too. Would you lift your hand around that? So, okay, that's helpful. If you need a summary of the plans, would you lift the hand? And that's on the handout. So we'd like to hear some of that. How many of you have heard the plans already, either I know in the clergy session? Okay. All right. If you've heard the plans, how many of you would like to hear a little bit more about the plans or a little more detail? Okay. All right. So I'm not going to just cover the summary on the sheet then. We'll try to cover that a little bit deeper. How many of you would like to hear something about the pension implications of the plans? Would you lift your hand if you would? Okay, the pension implications for the church. And then how many of you would like to hear something about the technicalities around how General Conference is going to work? I would too. So anyway, that one. Okay. So that helps me a lot. I'm going to give just a really quick catch up on where we are in the history of how we gathered here together. I'm going to monitor time here and watch for this. Also, Dr. Joe Harris is down here about the fourth row from Amen Corner. And if you've got burning questions and you want to write those down and give them to him, then that'll be fine. I've not really set this up with this large a group for questions. Don't want to take questions disguised as speeches or debates or demeaning other people. So any of that stuff we're not going to do. So let me go here with kind of where we are. This the Commission on the Way Forward has emerged out of a decision at the 2016 General Conference. It was a motion was made that the bishops develop a commission who would work on a way forward in all areas related to human sexuality, and the commission was formed. It was called the Commission on the Way Forward, and the commission recognizes, and the General Conference does, that we have different values in our church. And those roughly have been identified by the summary documents that I've received. And I want you to know I'm working from the 93-page summary is kind of what I'm quoting from, unless I indicate otherwise. It says there are traditionalist, contextual, and progressive values. Traditionalists value marriage between one man and one woman and sexual activity within this relationship. Traditionalists seek greater accountability at every level of the church. Contextualists want to translate the gospel into the varied settings in which God has placed us. They see this as a missiological calling and believe the work of the church can be adapted in a local church. Progressives view full inclusion of all persons in the life and church at every level, and this includes the LGBTQ community. They also believe the church can celebrate same-gender marriages. So that is a summary of the basis for how the Commission on the Way Forward views the various aspects of the church, or the various bodies within the church today. The commission itself met over an extended period of time, about 2 years, more or less. They met in local churches. They've collaborated well with one another, formed a relationship of trust, listened to one another, and have drafted a covenant together, and then they've consulted with other agencies of the church in developing the recommendations. The mission of the commission was to bring together persons deeply committed to the future or futures of the United Methodist Church, with an openness to developing new relationships with each other and exploring the potential futures or future of our denomination. We have a profound hope and confidence in the triune God, and yet we acknowledge that we do this work in the climate of skepticism and distrust from a human point of view. We are a connection. We admit that our communion is strained, yet much transformative mission across our world is the fruit of collaboration. And so the present issues of the day have opened the door to further conversation with one another. And I would invite you to look at the work done by the Commission and the work that's before us as an opportunity for conversation versus the attempt to create legislation to fix something or somebody or whatever like that. So it is a gift for us to collaborate and to converse together. The vision of the Commission was to design a way for being a church that maximizes the presence of a United Methodist witness in as many places in the world as possible, that allows for as much contextual differentiation as possible, and that balances an approach to different theological understandings of human sexuality with a desire for as much unity as possible. So that vision has guided the work of the Commission and what it has recommended. The scope, we should be open to new ways of embodying unity. In other words, the church of the future may look different than the church of today. Connectionalism may be defined differently than we've historically defined it, and it's just asking for an openness about that. And that is requested. The openness to be in unity together is an issue that is larger than the present impasse within the church and the cycle of action and reaction around ministry and human sexuality. So the church is seeking to find a way forward that defines us both as a movement and as a church, and reminded of about 4 points here. First, the mission of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, and remind us that that's God's mission, it's not ours. So we are participating with God in that mission. The church exists to bring people to a saving knowledge of God through Christ, to make and develop Christian disciples, to worship the triune God, and to partner in God's mission in the world. Mission is a shared responsibility between clergy and laity. I think everyone in the Commission affirms these things, and these are points of unity within the church, regardless of one's perspective otherwise. Mission is incarnational. God's mission always happens in specific times and places, and thus it looks different in different contexts. We already know that and experience that today in many ways. All Christians everywhere are participants in God's mission of reconciliation, healing, and restoration. While all United Methodists participate in the church's mission, we all do not participate in the same way. And so this is kind of the background that has brought us to this day and to this point in history. The Commission did release its findings. At the end of October, the Judicial Council will review all of the plans that have been submitted to determine which ones are constitutional, and if any of the plans are not found to be constitutional in whole, which parts are constitutional and which are not. So there's a big question to be resolved at the end of the month, and nobody knows the answer to that today. The Council on Bishops recommended a plan called the One Church Plan, and I think what I'd like to do is just jump right to the One Church Plan and talk about that a little bit. I'm going to talk more about that plan than the others because this is also the recommendation of the Commission on the way forward. As I understand the agenda today, and things are still shifting, things are not all settled, the way I understand it is that the Commission on the Way Forward report, the One Church Plan, is the plan that will be submitted for consideration to the General Conference. The other plans, as you have summaries before you on the summary sheet there, the other plans are also submitted as points of history and information. It was the feeling of the council as a whole, and about 88% of the people on the council voted for this. It's as close to unanimity as I've seen, was to put the whole work in front of the whole church so that nothing's kind of hidden away. The One Church Plan, I understand that this was not voted on, but there were about 18 of 32 people on the Commission on the Way Forward. 18 of 32 people endorsed the One Church Plan. So what I want to do now is just cover a bit more about this. I've got, if you want to look at these bullet points, you can. I'm going to work more out of the document today, I think, though. Here is a rationale for the One Church Plan. The One Church Plan gives churches the room they need to maximize the presence of a United Methodist witness in as many places in the world as possible. Changes to the adaptable paragraphs in the Book of Discipline apply only to the jurisdictional conferences in the United States. Central conferences, through the work of the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, will have the authority to retain their present language regarding chargeable offenses of clergy and questions of ordination related to homosexuality found in the current Book of Discipline. And they can also adopt these words and the paragraphs to best suit their missional context. Would it be helpful for this body for me to talk about a jurisdictional conference a little bit? Would you raise your hand if that'd be helpful to you? Okay. Does everybody understand what an annual conference is? Anybody need to know what an annual conference is? Okay, the jurisdictional conference is composed of the annual conferences in our region of the country. So annual conferences in Oklahoma, we're the leaders, of course, Texas, New Mexico, Arkansas, Louisiana, Kansas, Nebraska, and Missouri. That's all our jurisdiction. I think I got them all. And so that forms the jurisdiction. And when it talks about that these apply to jurisdictionals, that's basically the church inside the United States. So when it talks about jurisdictional conferences, we're talking about U.S. churches. Churches beyond the United States do have, and they currently have, freedom to modify the Book of Discipline according to their needs. Let me read a little bit more to you here on the One Church Plan. The One Church Plan provides a generous unity that gives conferences, churches, and pastors the flexibility to uniquely reach their missional context without disbanding the connectional ministry of the United Methodist Church. In the One Church Plan, no annual conferences, bishops, congregations, or pastors are compelled to act contrary to their convictions. The plan maintains the leadership structure of the United Methodist Church, including the Council on Bishops, the General Conference, the annual conferences as one body and one church. It offers greater freedom to many who desire change but do not want to violate the Book of Discipline. Voting is kept to a minimum except where it's helpful. There's no mandate that requires local churches, conferences, or pastors to participate in a vote that divides, segments, or separates. Now let me see. What I want to do now, I do want to give to you proposed changes in the Book of Discipline that emerged from the One Church Plan. This is an amendment to paragraph 105, and 105 is our theological task. And here are the words that are recommended be inserted. It says, we agree that we are not, let me start over. We agree that we are not of one mind regarding human sexuality. As we continue to faithfully explore issues of sexuality, we will honor the theological guidelines of Scripture, reason, tradition, and experience, acknowledging that God's revelation of truth and God's extension of grace as expressed in Jesus Christ may cause persons of good conscience to interpret and decide issues of sexuality differently. We also acknowledge that the church is called through Christ to unity even amidst complexity. We affirm those who continue to maintain that the scriptural witness does not condone the practice of homosexuality. We believe that their conscience should be protected in the church and throughout society under basic principles of religious liberty. We also affirm those who believe the witness of Scripture calls us to reconsider the teachings of the church with respect to monogamous homosexual relationships. The rationale around that says this edition acknowledges the common theological guidelines that are the sources of the diverse views of our global church regarding human sexuality, and it recognizes the desire of the church to fulfill God's call to unity while holding a convicted humility toward one another as we honor religious liberty for all. Paragraph 161C in the social principles, marriage, it offers these changes. It says, and this is from the old, I'll indicate the word that's changed. We affirm the sanctity of the insert word, monogamous, and this goes back to the discipline as it is. We affirm the sanctity of the monogamous marriage covenant that is expressed in love, mutual support, personal commitment, and shared fidelity, traditionally understood as a union of one man and one woman. And the phrase traditionally understood as a union of one man and one woman replaces the phrase between a man and woman. Going down a little further, the sentence that says we support laws in civil society that define marriage as the union of one man and one woman is replaced by the sentence where laws in civil society define marriage as a union between two adults. No United Methodist clergy shall be required to celebrate or bless a same-sex union. Essentially, what this does is it opens the doors for clergy to follow their own conscience. It does later on remove any oversight of a bishop or district superintendent. A superintendent or bishop cannot say to a pastor, you can or you cannot marry a person. Or two people, excuse me. And that decision is made by the pastor. So my understanding is that applies equally to ordained and licensed pastors. So now that's my interpretation, so that may be wrong. But that's what I think is correct. There is a change also in 161G of the social principles. It says, although all persons are sexual beings, whether or not they are married, sexual relations are affirmed only within the covenant of monogamous and currently the language heterosexual marriage. That's going to be changed or proposed to be changed to, although all persons are sexual beings, whether or not they are married, sexual relations are affirmed only within the covenant of monogamous marriage between two adults. It does strike as well the sentence that says the United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. That sentence is struck without a replacement. Qualifications for ordination. The responsibility, this is new, the responsibility for determining how standards, including standards relating to human sexuality, may apply to certification or ordination in a given annual conference, falls to the Conference Board of Ordained Ministry and the clergy session of the annual conference. The bishop may choose to seek the non-binding advice of an annual conference session on standards relating to human sexuality for ordination to inform the Board of Ordained Ministry in its work. I think the other, let's see, I want to see if there's anything that's different. In 329.4, well, this is for deacons. The same thing is for elders as well. In conferences where civil law permits a pastor to perform a same-sex marriage service, no deacon or elder or local pastor, as I interpret the legislation, in full connection, well, this is deacon or elder in full connection, so I have not found specific legislation on local pastors, so I'm making the assumption that anybody that's ordained or licensed is included. That's my assumption, so if it's wrong, it's my error, so please, please be gracious. No deacon in full connection or elder shall at any time be required or compelled to perform or prohibited from performing any marriage, union, or blessing of same-sex couples or of any couples. Each clergy person shall have the right to exercise his or her conscience to refuse or agree when requested to perform any marriages, unions, or blessings as a matter of his or her individual religious liberty. 334.6 applies to the elders, the same thing to the elders. Okay. I'm going to go back now to pick up some of the commentary. In the One Church Plan, this plan remains in, the United Methodist Church remains in connection, upholding unity of mission without uniformity of practice. The plan grants space for traditionalists to continue to offer ministry as they have in the past. Thank you. And space for progressives to exercise freely a more complete ministry with LGBTQ persons, and space for all United Methodists to continue to coexist without disrupting their ministries. Additionally, this plan creates space for annual conferences in various parts of the world to practice ministry according to their national or regional contexts. The One Church Plan removes the language from the Book of Discipline used in the United States that restricts pastors and churches from conducting same-sex weddings and annual conferences from ordaining self-avowed practicing homosexual persons. It adds language that intentionally protects the religious freedom of pastors and churches who choose not to perform or host same-sex weddings, and boards of ministry and bishops who choose not to credential or ordain self-avowed practicing homosexual persons. Central conferences can adapt. The plan ends the threat of church trials over same-sex weddings. Board of Ministry already has the authority to discern whom to credential. Local churches already have the authority to establish wedding policies. Local churches already have the right and the authority to determine their wedding policies, and there is provision for a local church to determine to have same-sex unions in their church or not to. Actually, there's no requirement to change anything if a church wishes to continue not to offer the opportunity. There is provision that requires a church conference to vote to change that policy. The One Church Plan acknowledges that practices among vital churches need room to thrive depending on their mission field, and the necessary incarnational identification with those whom we seek to serve. The variety of answers to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" determines how practices in one context will differ from the other. Well, the Commission hears a yearning from both traditionalists and progressives for more space. More space means more structural distance from people who practice ministry differently, or more autonomy to adopt practices to the context that may not be requested elsewhere. Let me do a check-in with you. Is this information helpful to you? Is it beyond what you want to hear? Well, I started to say, if it's beyond what you want to hear, raise your hand. This gets pretty much in the weeds of things, doesn't it? Let me skip ahead just a little bit. I'm going to continue kind of down the same, just working through this a little bit more. This is about local churches, the effects of the one church plan on each segment of the United Methodist Church. First, local churches are not required to vote. Most would likely make no changes in practice at the local level. So, paraphrasing all the changes before, the proposed changes in the discipline would allow a local church to govern itself in determining wedding policies. It would allow an annual conference to govern itself in terms of ordination policies, whereas now, currently, those things are prohibited. Pastors who want to perform a wedding outside of church property could do so based on their own conscience and in consultation with their leaders. So if a church said, don't do the wedding in this church, the pastor still would be free to do a same-gender wedding should that individual wish to do so. Clergy would have the freedom to exercise individual conscience. Clergy could place in their clergy profile their theological convictions with the bishop and cabinet. Could take those convictions into account through the appointive and transfer process. No annual conferences would have to vote on the matter. Boards of ministry or annual conference sessions, or annual conference clergy sessions who wish to ordain LGBTQ clergy or wish to add language to their standing rules to restrict ordination could enter into a discernment process with the Board of Ministry in consultation with the bishop and cabinet. So there's room for dialogue and for the annual conference to make decisions around that. Council and bishops would remain as one body. Not a whole lot changes there outside of what I've already indicated in just the other things. Episcopal fund, the commission recognizes the Episcopal fund that pays the salary and expenses of bishops, and both retired and active, by the way. Those things would still be paid. There have been questions of does my conference pay for everybody else? And I think every conference except maybe one in the United States raises funds to pay for its own bishop. Their apportionment covers that. And then it also covers the whole world. So there are folks that say, well, I want to be sure my dollar goes to my bishop, and I think that's pretty well cared for throughout the thing. The advantages of the plan. The one church plan as it is does not appear to require changes to the United Methodist Constitution. Of course, this will be determined. If it passes at the 2019 General Conference, it can take effect on January 1st, 2020. However, to allow central conferences, annual conferences, pastors, etc., to vote on, to get this done, the recommendation is that it be deferred until starting the year 2021, I think. If you look on the One Church Plan, the summary sheet, let me just cover a couple of things that I haven't covered already. The last point, there's no provision for a gracious exit. I do note one of the plans does have, the Traditionalist Plan has a provision for the gracious exit. I do want to say that from the work I've done with the Council on Bishops, that I think in the mind of that body, it's dangerous to speak for the body, at least I'll say for me, the term gracious has not been defined. Is it, and you know, there was one piece of that said gracious in process, so that means I'll be nice to you, or not I, we'll be nice to one another, but still enforce whatever's in the discipline. You know, that's gracious. Another thing on gracious, I'm not really going to take questions, so, but thank you. If you got one, hand it to Joe, and that'll be fine. Right now, any exit is governed by the annual conference, and that is housed in the conference. The conference has a policy to deal with churches that want to leave the denomination. We've already used that three or four, maybe 5 times since I've been here, and our trustees administer that. We try to be gracious in that we don't carry a big club and hit people over the head with it. But then we also are charged to care for the assets of the United Methodist Church. So all of these things have been negotiated on a one-time basis, not setting a precedent for however everything else is going to be dealt with. So that's what we have right now. There are a lot of questions around that, and I don't have very many answers for it. So what the assumption is under the One Church Plan is that the provisions in the Book of Discipline as far as a church wanting to exit will remain as they are. So I think that's the summary. That's a pretty good summary of that. I will say, do you have a clarifying question? Okay. Thank you. Okay. I didn't mean to be rude at all to you. I think I'm going to move to the Connectional Conference Plan next. The Connectional Conference Plan was also received by the Commission on the Way Forward, and it was forwarded. This plan was developed and worked with, fleshed out by the Commission on the Way Forward, and it was not adopted by the Council on Bishops. I believe there were about 12, I think it was 12 persons out of 32 that expressed support for this plan. Now, you could vote more than once as well, so that I haven't gone through and tried to add all this kind of stuff up. The One Church Plan, the Connectional Conference Plan begins by asking a different question. And the question really is, what is the best way for us to stay in relationship with one another, acknowledge our differences, and extend the witness of the United Methodist Church in the world in most places we can. The Connectional Conference Plan reflects a unified core that includes shared doctrines and services. The plan creates 3 value-based connectional conferences that have distinctive definitions of accountability, contextualization, and justice. Currently, the central conferences, the conferences beyond the United States, would have the choice of joining one of 3 conferences within the United States. We would change the jurisdictional conferences to what's being called connecting conferences. And those connecting conferences would be defined by each other according to whether they had a traditional view of the world, a unity view of the world, or a progressive view of the world. And each jurisdiction would determine which connecting conference, which value-based connecting conference they would belong to. It would not be by geography. And so a jurisdiction would make up its mind, we're going to be conference, I'm going to use numbers, conference number 2. And every annual conference within that jurisdiction would be part of connecting conference number 2. But if an annual conference said, we don't want to be in connecting conference number 2, we want to be in connecting conference number 1, there could be a vote of that annual conference, and I think it's 55%. I've forgotten that exact number. 55% majority could vote to be in conference number 1 instead of conference number 2. If you're a local church and you say, well, our conference, our jurisdiction went to number 2, our conference went to number 1, but we want to go to number 3, then a local church could vote, and it's a church conference, so anybody that's on the membership rolls of the church from as long as they're alive, you know, even if they haven't been in the church in decades and decades, could come back and have a vote to belong to connecting conference number 3. It would take a majority to do that. Clergy would choose whether they wanted to be in conference number 1, number 2, or number 3. Bishops would decide the same thing. Retired clergy would decide the same thing. And so everyone would determine we're going to align ourselves with an annual conference who thinks and practices more like we do. And we would all still be connected as 3 different branches of Methodism. Each branch could or might not use the cross and flame as its logo. You know, might or might not use the Methodist name. It might have a, you know, there's a lot of unknowns around that. The thing that, you know, that's kind of off-putting really, but I heard Bishop Muller was here and he presented to the delegates a couple of days ago an excellent presentation. And he said that there are a couple of assumptions that he wants to share that really makes me think about the connecting conference. So I don't want to present it and just say, well, this is so complicated, nobody can understand it, and it's not helpful. Actually, assumption number 1 about this, the issues before us are not issues to be managed, but they're opportunities for something new. So I encourage us not to look at our brothers and sisters as people to be managed. And I'm talking to all of us. You know, you may have an opinion that's with conference number 2 and you think I was trying to say, let's make a deal. Door number 1. We don't like door number 1, we got to manage them. Or door number 3, we got to manage them. We are not in the business of managing everybody else. So we look at each other as an opportunity to learn something new versus a problem to manage. That actually is a concept that would go a long way in our whole lives, both within ourselves and in our interpersonal relationships. The second assumption is that the world is made up of very different contexts. And we're not going to do stuff the same. We're not ever going to do stuff the same. And so if we do what we always do and it doesn't produce fruit or it fractures us, you know, one of the proponents for this plan is that if we don't have this plan, we're going to just fracture. And that'll be more damaging than having a planned choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. I thought that was a good insight that Bishop Muller shared. This is a new form of connectionalism, and it is only the beginning of a long journey. It allows a new unity to grow through our connection to Jesus Christ. It loosens the conflict because people are able to find a place that's home for them, and it preserves the core and essentials of the Wesleyan and Methodist and United Methodist movements. The Connecting Conference is the primary vehicle for carrying out the mission. Right now, the annual conference is the primary vehicle for carrying out the mission. So I have not yet gotten my mind around that. But the primary vehicle will either have values that are expressed in a progressive, a unity, or a traditional manner, and that will determine how the mission is carried out by that arm of the church. It proposes far-reaching structural change. And in my, told this to the bishops, in my humble opinion, spoken with pride, you have to think about that. My humble opinion, spoken with pride, we got a lot of structural reform in the United Methodist Church to become effective. This pushes us into structural reform, and it probably doesn't push us far enough, actually. That's my radical hat on, and I would probably be scared to death to think about what it might look like. One of the other things, it will be messy and it will be hard. It'll be all-consuming. It requires that everybody make a choice. So, which group are you going to be part of? Everybody's got to make that choice. That may or may not be helpful. But it does have a robust fulfillment of the mission, vision, and scope of the Commission on the Way Forward. I did not, and some of you may think, thank the Lord, I did not include in my presentation I've got on the computer specific legislative paragraph changes because they are so many and it is so far-reaching, and I lost my voice just trying to do one of those. I'm not sure, but it is wide-ranging change. Let's see if I can go to the summary sheet and see if I can pick up anything that I really want to highlight. Oh, yes, it does. It does require a lot of voting, and it requires a bunch of constitutional amendments. And constitutional amendments don't warm the hearts of many Methodists, but it will take a number of them. All of these may take constitutional amendments, so anyway, I just don't know. We don't know yet. That's a summary of the Connectional Conference Plan. I think I've got that kind of down here. Now I want to share with you some of the points of the Traditionalist Plan. The Traditionalist Plan maintains the current language in the Book of Discipline. And it says that the problem is not about our disagreement, but about cultural change. And do we change? Does the church change? We are here today because some folks have acted in principled disobedience to the Book of Discipline today. This is the first action since 1844. And so the Traditionalist Plan is offering its proposal as well. The Traditionalist Plan was not developed by the Commission on the Way Forward. After the I think May meeting of the Council on Bishops, a group of bishops were asked to flesh out and I was not part of the group. I was not part of the group on any of this stuff, actually. Were asked to flesh out what that might look like. And in many ways, well, let me just go here with what's in the document again. Appendix 3 of the document is the best resource for the traditional plan. Summary of the plan. The model maintains the current stance of the church regarding the definition of marriage and ministry of and with LGBTQ persons. It flows from the presupposition that the United Methodist Church ought to have one unified moral stance on the issues of marriage and sexuality. This model continues to affirm that LGBTQ persons are welcome to attend worship services, participate in church programs, receive the sacraments, upon baptism be admitted as baptized members, and upon taking vows of membership become members of local churches. At the same time, the traditional model acknowledges the deep contentious objections on the part of some to the current stance and practices of the church. It accommodates those objections by fostering a gracious and respectful way for those persons who cannot live within the current boundaries of the church, or within the current boundaries of church practice, to form or join self-governing bodies that allow them the freedom to follow their conscience and institute practices in keeping with their understanding of Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. Such a self-governing body could constitute a Wesleyan denomination that could maintain an ongoing connection with the United Methodist Church through a concordant agreement. I'm not going to go into concordant agreements unless you want to stay late. Various changes are proposed to increase the accountability of bishops and conferences for upholding and enforcing the Book of Discipline. Essentially what this proposal does, it basically strengthens the language, it maintains the language in the current discipline. It adds it creates structures and has specific penalties for persons who disobey the Book of Discipline in terms of same-gender marriage and ordination. As local churches are not required to vote, most would likely make no change in practice at their local level. If their annual conference chooses to remain United Methodist and local churches wish to join a new self-governing church, it could be done by a majority vote. Doing so would allow them, here's the gracious exit, I think, defined by the traditional plan. Doing so would allow them to keep their property, assets, and liabilities in exchange for a payment to the annual conference of their fair share of the conference's unfunded pension liability. No other payment would be required. Local churches located in an annual conference that votes to establish or join a self-governing church would not be required to vote if they agree with their annual conference decision. Local churches that would prefer to remain United Methodist and continue to abide by the Book of Discipline could choose to do so by a simple majority vote of their church conference. In such cases, they would also need to pay their annual conference, the annual conference or fair share of the conference's unfunded pension liability, since that remains with the annual conference. In other words, a church that does not want to abide by the Book of Discipline would be given opportunity to exit the denomination with its property and assets would stay with them. Let's see. Thank you. The plan allows people to follow their conscience with a with the provision of a gracious exit. It strengthens accountability. That was the piece I was going to go on. The accountability strengthening would be that it would require pastors, boards of ordained ministries, and bishops, everyone involved, to basically sign that they will uphold the discipline. It has specific penalties for people who violate the discipline. I think one of those is on a first offense of doing one same-gender marriage, the penalty, if I recall correctly, is a year suspension. And the second time, one would be would lose their credentials. Gracious exit requires 55% of the majority. The petitions that the traditional plan offers defines a self-avowed practicing homosexual. I think the Judicial Council did that at one of their recent rulings, but anyway, it defines that. It makes the accountability to the Council on Bishops easier and changes procedures, so that it makes it much clearer for I think as few as 7 bishops could file a complaint, and then a council relation committee then would have to process that complaint against another bishop who disobeyed the discipline. It prohibits the ordination of a self-avowed practicing homosexual. Board of Ministry members must certify they'll uphold the Book of Discipline. DCOMs must also certify. It restores the complaint process of 2008, which makes it more difficult to dismiss a complaint. And then any just resolution must include a commitment not to repeat an action. Okay. The implementation day of that is immediately following the General Conference. So if a Traditionalist Plan is adopted, it would go into effect the day after General Conference. The Commission, let me give you the history of it. There were originally 3 plans in the Commission on the Way Forward. About a year or so ago at the Council on Bishops meeting, there was a straw poll where bishops were asked, which of the 2 plans would you support? And the straw poll, now only active bishops can vote, so there was no control over the straw poll. So whoever wanted to wrote down 2 things, and it was never reported back, except that the 2 things that the bishops supported were the one church and the connecting church. And so that's how the traditional model was dropped. And the Commission on the Way Forward only had time to really flesh out 2 plans given the time limitations. And so that was the process for moving that down. At a subsequent Council on Bishops meeting, actually the one in May, I think it was, last one we had, there was a significant number of bishops asking what happened to the traditional plan. And so essentially, and this wasn't parliamentary procedure, so I'm really having trouble recounting what happened, and I don't know if I even should be or not. So if I'm violating confidentiality, it's all over the internet. But that was restored, and the request from the council was that all 3 plans be presented ultimately. And it's my understanding that the council asked for assistance in writing that, and there were bishops who helped to write the summary of that plan. That may be, I hope that's correct. In fact, it's correct, in fact, as far as I know. So there were 2 plans that actually were vetted by the Commission on the Way Forward. There is ultimately one plan that the Commission recommends, which is the one church model. There are all 3 plans that are sent forward because the feeling of the council was that it's important that all the work done be able to be accessed by the General Conference. So that's kind of the rationale of all of that. And the rest of the stuff, I don't know. But that's about how that got there. So, okay, how are we doing on time? This goes longer than my sermon does. I think I'll see if there's any other questions for clarification. Yes?
Bishop, you have indicated that the committee, 18 of the 32 committees recommended the one church plan.
Yes.
And I believe you said 12 of the conference plan. How many of the traditional plan did they?
Thank you for that. I intended to say that and I didn't, so I appreciate that. The number of people, and I'll just get you all on board with the question. There were, I believe, 18 of 32 for the one church plan who signed off for that. There were, I think, 12 on the Connectional conference plan that supported that. There were 9 on the traditional plan that supported that.
Now my second question is, will the committee or the council of bishops take an official position and or be actively campaigning for one of the other plans, either as a group, meaning the committee as a whole, or the council of bishops as a whole, or as individuals? Will any of them be actively campaigning?
Okay, question, will anybody be actively campaigning? I can answer this pretty easily. It depends on the bishop. There's some that'll be very active for one plan or another. There is not a coordinated effort, and there's not a campaign that you couldn't get everybody on the same page if you wanted to. The council is reflective of the church. And so people are free to act on their conscience on that. So hopefully that caught that. So any other? Yes?
How many delegates does the South Central jurisdiction have to the General Conference, and how many members from Oklahoma, who are they?
Linda, did you hear that question? How many delegates? There are about 865 at the whole thing. How many from the South Central jurisdiction? There's about 230, I'm guessing. And then how many from Oklahoma, and who are they? We have 14. I can't name them. If you're a delegate, well, do I dare put you all? If you're a delegate, why don't you stand up? And actually, folks, this is hard work. So I would just ask you not to, yeah. It's like, thank you. Joe, have you got some, well, bring me a couple of questions here. Yeah, that'll be great. If you'll do that, that'll save my voice.
Okay, we do have questions that were sent to me, and I'm going to try to do them as they were sent to me in the order they were sent to me, or at least we'll see what we get to here. One question had to do with, a couple of questions had to do with appointments. And I think this question sums up the other questions too. How do you anticipate one church model will affect the appointment process?
Well, right now, when we look at a church that's open or appointment that's open, we start with a question: what's the mission field around that church? Then we look at the church and we try to figure out. Well, I'll tell you, our superintendents do an outstanding job of being able to articulate where churches are in terms of really almost everything, from how strong are your finances, what's the state of the church, what are the strongest ministries, what kind of leadership do we need, what theological approach is the best for this place. So we kind of call that the church profile. And the church profile is where we start, and then we make nominations from anybody's kind of fair game. We try not to move everybody every 6 months, but who fits that profile is the question. Who is the best missional fit for that profile? And that's how we do it. And then we just work down to figure out who's the best fit, and then the process works itself out from there. I actually don't see that changing. We already do that. We consider theological perspective along with everything else, and try to make a good match that helps a church grow in its context. The client of the conference is the local church. If we don't get the appointment right, then we get to do it over again next year. So we really try to match those things already. And this is my personal opinion, I think it would be really an error to narrow our focus to one thing and say we're going to make appointments based on this. And in the old days, that one thing may have been salary or prestige of appointment or whatever. If I had to narrow it to one thing, what is the mission field? What are the needs of that local church to engage its mission field? So that's enough of that.
Another question is, in view of the diminishing conference apportionments, does any plan beside the one church plan reasonably anticipate survival of general boards and agencies?
The general boards, I can't speak for them. I do know that they are in the process right now of looking at their budgets and realigning those budgets. And I think that the general agencies all know that some kind of change is coming. And I think this is not a real good answer to that specific thing. I really can't answer it, but I think that I will say this, that the model and assumptions that we've used for our financial strength in the past are not sustainable in the future. So we have got to think of new ways, and how are we going to fund the ministry at both the local level, the conference level, and the general church level. These plans really don't deal with that. But that is a need we got to do.
This next one is a question of process. If a one church plan is presented and voted upon at General Conference and it fails, are other plans presented for vote? In other words, what is the process if the proposed plans fail?
That is a question that's really difficult to answer because the committee on the agenda has not yet met. In fact, that's a question we bishops were discussing among ourselves, and we don't know the answer to that. I do think that in general legislative terms, the legislative pieces go to committee, committees vet them, they make a recommendation to the general conference, and then that body votes on them. I've got a feeling there'll be more than one petition that will come before general conference. So I don't think, and in light of the Judicial Council ruling, there are, in addition to these plans, either 51 or 61 additional plans or petitions being submitted. So there are, I think, 99 total petitions. So between all of those, well, no, it's general cost. It's hard to say. Surely we can pass one, but I don't know if I want to even say that. I do want to lower expectation. Everything wrong with the church will not be fixed in February. So anyway, yeah.
This is a question not about one of the plans, but about a potential another plan, so I'm going to phrase it this way.
Okay.
Could a simple plan be considered that simply removed the discriminatory language from the current Book of Discipline?
I have heard through the grapevine, although I've not seen the other petitions, that is one of the 99 petitions that'll be submitted or has been submitted. We get those petitions, I think it's November 23rd. So I can answer that in November 23rd.
Okay.
So theoretically, sure, anything that comes before General Conference can be passed. It can be amended. So whatever comes can be amended and then voted on. So yeah, anything's possible.
Okay, this may be a question for Linda, for others who are on the delegation. Have our Oklahoma Conference delegates listened to LGBTQ persons and their parents before going to this meeting in February? Have they heard their stories?
We receive letters and emails from different groups, and we have been asked to meet with some folks, and there is a meeting planned in November to meet with a representative from a group of I don't think I want to say the name of the church, but just, so yes, we will.
So would that be open to invitation to other people, or have I just opened a can of worms that you don't want to?
We will certainly take all requests. We realize we cannot travel all over Oklahoma and meet with every small group that wants to meet with us, but we are committed to hearing where people are. On behalf of the delegation, I think I can say that that it is important that we listen to each other, and so we are open to listening. We don't want to get into debates or what's right, what's wrong, or is there one right or one wrong, but we do want to listen.
Point of clarification, do you vote your own conscience or the conscience of your congregation?
Of a congregation, no. We had this discussion at our meeting just about 2 hours ago, and from the laity perspective, now this was just what was said, those of you who were there, if I misrepresent this, let me know, is that when laity are elected as delegates, they run on a platform. They have that laid out in their letter of application, and so people, our laity, express they feel like they were voted because of their position. And with clergy, it's not necessarily that way. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you.
That was actually another one of the written questions that came about voting. Does the delegation vote as a block or they vote individually? I think Linda just answered that. Another question that came was, with the growth of the central conferences and their no tolerance in the stance in the area of human sexuality, how can any change in the system happen? In other words, how will their vote potentially affect the whole General Conference?
Well, their vote, there's a formula for delegates, and so whatever the formula is, that's the representation of Central Conference folks. I think in 2008 there was a proposal that involved several constitutional amendments that ultimately did not prevail, that would have made the United States the equivalent of a central conference. And we'd have had central conferences, we'd have been one of many instead of now we have jurisdictions, everybody else has central conferences, and the proposal was that we be a central conference just like everybody else, and then every other central conference would have jurisdictions. That didn't pass, and so that would be one way to move United States issues into the United States, but that's not in this proposal either. So right now, I don't want to presume to speak for delegates from anywhere on how they're going to vote. That includes Oklahoma, by the way. So I'm not engaged and not going to engage in trying to twist arms and strong-arm people and say, if you don't vote this way, your appointment's in jeopardy, or, any of that nonsense. I'm not doing any of that.
And that relates to another question that was asked similar to this last question about the General Conference itself. Is General Conference just a United States conference with delegates, or is it international? And if so, who represents the international?
General Conference is international, and can any of y'all help me with the percentage now? It's like 38, 40, is that roughly it? Of 38 to 40%, maybe 35 to 45, that may be good, are international delegates. They are from Africa, from primarily Philippines, even though also Europe and Asia, and what's the other continent I'm leaving out?
Philippines?
The Philippines, yeah. not South America, because the South American churches are all affiliated churches. So, you know, when I said I wasn't going to talk about them, they are independent, non-United Methodist churches. So like the church in Bolivia is not the United Methodist Church in Bolivia, it's the Bolivian Methodist Church. The same way with Chile and all the other, Cuba, et cetera, Mexico. So they're all independent of us. We're related as being Methodist, but we're not under the same polity.
This is the last question that was handed to me. I understand traditional and progressive. Please explain characteristics of a unity connectional conference.
Okay. I'm sorry that I'm not as clear on that, because I'm not as clear on that. First of all, the way I understand it, the connectional conferences would be structured by values. So either you choose the value set that you adhere to. The progressive, the unity, or the traditional. Or in other words, if you're traditional, we're going to take basically the traditional platform, and that's that wing of the church. If you are progressive, take the wing of the platform that basically does away with any restrictions. It's pretty much like the one church model, but it would be restricted to those persons who believe the one church model. And then the unity would basically say, we want to try to find a middle way. And the conferences would be unique and would be structured around whether we're going to tighten our book of discipline, loosen our book of discipline, or basically keep our book of discipline pretty much intact, but have more of a live and let live attitude. The form of those conferences and the book of discipline from those conferences can take whatever form that the body wishes to develop. And its timeline is over, I think, about 6 years before it's ultimately implemented. So that's why I'm so vague on that. I don't know if that's even helpful or not, but the way I think of it is to take the one church model, the traditionalist model, and those are the one church is two branches. One church is kind of like the unity branch. The traditionalist models are traditional, and in the unity branch, with no guarantees for any clergy who have objection in principle to doing same-gender weddings, or any sign of, I think what folks in progressive group would say, any signs of discrimination against anyone, all of those things would go away, and that would be the platform of the progressives. So the one church model would look the most like the hybrid. That's the one that's been recommended. Traditionalists would look like a traditional model, and then the progressive one would look like the progressive elements of the one church model. That's the best I can do.
Sounds good. Those are the questions that were submitted. If you have a question and you think of it, oh, when I get home, I wish I'd asked this question, please send us emails. We invited the clergy to do that when we went over these plans, and we invite each of you and those who are watching by live streaming just to send us emails with your questions. If you also go on our website next week, you will see a video of this presentation, as well as several links that we've collected from about the different plans from across the church. So you'll be able to see those plans both in visual, also read some more about them, and see what others might be, how they might be exploring each of these plans. So thank you so much for your attention. My email address is jharris@okumc.org. jharris@okumc.org. All right.
Everybody send Joe a kind word. Thank you, Joe, for A, keeping me straight, and B, for all that you do. A lot of it is unseen and behind the scenes, but just excellent work, so thank you. Friends, I appreciate your spirit, and I hope this has been helpful. I stand before you as a clay vessel that sure doesn't know it all. I hope I didn't give you too much wrong information. I apologize if I did. I hope that I did not unfairly represent one group at the expense of another, so that was certainly not my motivation. My hope was that I conveyed information in a relatively fair and relatively unbiased way. That's why I read so much from the report, to try to do that. So I would like now to, I think that, I know it's tempting to just say it's over and it's time to go, but we would like to end the time together with the service of Holy Communion and worship. If we don't center ourselves a little bit on what is really important, and that's the love of God in Jesus Christ, then we've sort of missed the boat. If you need to run, that's fine. But I'd propose we take about a 5, maybe 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back, I promise, sing 2 hymns, we'll sing one, have communion together, sing one more, and then hit the door. So no more talking. So let's take about a 10-minute break. Thank y'all so much for coming today.